India is becoming the world's biggest driver of energy demand. IEA projects India will add over 15 exajoules of global demand by 2035, nearly as much as China and Southeast Asia combined. To discuss this, we have Ray Tay from Moody's Ratings and Rupam Saika from IGS. Welcome, Ray and Rupam. Let's begin with where this is coming from. Why is India becoming the largest driver of global energy demand?
India has been growing at a rate of about 6 to 7% now over the last few years and is expected to continue growing over the next probably a decade. And that coupled with rapid industrialization, urbanization, and rising incomes, these are the factors I think primarily which are driving the need for baseline energy. And to give you a kind of sense of scale of this, India is adding in terms of urban population equivalent to a major city each year. So consequently, increases in floor space, car ownership, white goods ownership, like air conditioners, all of these come together and lock in a higher electricity and energy demand.
I would say it's actually more accurate that it is the largest driver of global energy demand growth. And there are several dynamics at play here. Number one, India's GDP growth is a bright spot in the global economy. We project that India's real GDP growth will be around 6.4% for 2026 after a phenomenal 7.6% in 2025. And second point is India's large population. And I mentioned this not just because of the size of the population, but also because of the impact from the continued growth in India's per capita income, which has been growing, but yet at the moment remains the lowest amongst all investment grade sovereigns. Lastly, India's per capita consumption of power is also starting from a low base. So if we draw all this together, India's robust economic growth, favorable demographics, increasing urbanization, rising middle class, leading to an overall increase of per capita income and consumption from the world's largest population, the conclusion is actually very reasonable.
But this is huge. How is India preparing its grid to handle this surge then?
Substantial expansion is planned to strengthen India's power grid by 2032. For example, greater inter-regional transmission connectivity along the West Coast. Successful execution will be key for the country's carbon transition. We estimate that the overall grid investment requirements, including intrastate, regional transmission, as well as distribution, will likely average close to 1% of India's real GDP over the next 10 years.
India has got very ambitious plans in terms of expanding the grid. They've spent about 2 lakh crore on transmission infrastructure to integrate about 500 gigawatts of you can say fossil capacity, including green energy corridors, linking solar and wind states like Rajasthan and Gujarat to the consumption states all across the country. That's a big plan. I mean, there's a strong push for renewable, what you call excavation. Major projects going on and have been approved in 2025 to again connect the producing or the collection part of the energy to the ones consuming.
How about in terms of challenges? What challenges could slow India's transition as energy demand accelerates?
Grid expansion is one of them that I can think of at the moment. With rising demand, the growth or the grid rollout is not at par with production. So there's a mismatch between the renewable build out and creating the transmission infrastructure. So that is a possible bottleneck that has to be looked into. Of course, and add to that, there are other delays also in terms of land acquisition, which is always a challenge in India, opposition by stakeholders, another one of them. But I think those are being ironed out.
Well, the key point is that the investment required is actually massive. We have actually assessed the requirements for the power sector to help India achieve its 2070 net zero target. And we expect actually that the level of projected investments will be at around 2% per annum of GDP for the next 10 years. While we have the view that this annual investment amount is manageable for India, I want to make several points. Number one is that we do expect continued strong economic growth, and this implies actually an expansion of India's coal-based power generation capacity during this period, which will hinder carbon transition. Number two is that these estimates that we've got are based on a certain correlation between GDP and power demand growth. In other words, we think that India's power demand will grow by around 6% annually to support a GDP growth rate of around 6.5%. As India develops, however, that correlation might well change. Incremental investments will be required as India progressively electrifies its economy. And then third is that the other source of potentially strong incremental power demand growth would be data centers. India currently has around 1.25 gigawatts of data center capacity and is building another 800 megawatts. We're looking at a CAGR of 21% till 2030. Lastly, execution is key. Our projections is that India needs to add around 450 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity over the next 10 years.
Since you've both mentioned some of these already, which renewable technologies are expected to play the biggest role in this?
Well, solar and wind power will dominate the new generation capacity additions over the next, even 20-25 years, with nuclear and hydropower additions being smaller. We expect the installed generation capacity to increase by 2 to 2.2 times by fiscal 2034 to 35 to meet India's power demand growth of 1.7 times to 1.8 times in the same period. Now, non-fossil fuel power will account for 45 to 50% of total output in the same period, from around 23.5% in the last fiscal 23 to 24. Although solar and wind will be the backbone of India's transition, the way that these are being complemented by storage will be key. Essentially, India will need to be able to utilize these renewable resources during peak periods, and it is not necessarily where the sun is shining. So the key technology is actually storage, in particular pumped hydro storage as well as batteries.
There's one more thing that goes unnoticed here, and that is the existing infrastructure. Now, if we bring up the efficiency levels of existing power infrastructure, say like refineries, like power plants, they can really play a very critical role in this transition because, there are these kind of infrastructure, if you bring up their reliability, it doesn't cost much, but it can do a lot in terms of providing a stable base load production. So if we are able to figure out ways of running our power plants, our refineries more efficiently with lesser breakdown, I think that's going to be a key contributor towards this transition. And that's where we as a company come into the picture.
Thank you so much for your time today, Ray and Rupam. Looking forward to having you both back on the program.
Thank you, and bye.
Thank you very much.
Once again, those were Ray Tay, Associate Managing Director at Moody's Ratings, and Rupam Saikya, General Manager at IGS India. For more news, visit asian-power.com.